Okay. Let's talk about the correlation between first between ideology and radical acts. I read through two of your papers on the topic, and yeah, please maybe just you can talk about it better than I can. So maybe you can tell us what you found out about the relationship between ideology and.
So I think stemming in large part from the government definitions, but also layman's understanding of psychology, people tend to almost equate radicalization and ideology. And certainly, again, when the field that I'm in, the field of research of radicalization and terrorism, which it existed before 9/11, but after 9/11 is really when it took off. Like we produced 800% the number of publications after 9/11 than we did in all of our years before. So after 9/11, we collectively saw terrorism as Islamic terrorism, understandably, right? That was the most salient example. That was the example that the government wanted us to understand. And so, it kind of went hand in hand, ideology and radicalization. Um, However, the question of chicken and egg, if you will, always remained. And 20 plus years after 9/11, we have accumulated enough data in all kinds of forms, case studies, interviews, survey data, um, that suggest that ideology tends to be a symptom of radicalization, but not really its cause. In other words, people who become terrorists, who join terrorist groups, they tend to absorb ideology of the group that they belong, or the movement that they want to belong to, as they become progressively more radicalized. So if we're talking about Islamic,
Wait, sorry,
uh,
I have a question. I'm sorry that I'm cutting you off,
no,
but
no, go ahead.
I have to. So ideology is a symptom of radicalization, but isn't radicalization by definition don't you need an ideology in order to be radical, or can you be radical without having an ideology?
You do kind of need an ideology, but it doesn't mean that that's what makes you radical. So you also need a gun
Yeah.
or a bomb or a knife to become a terrorist. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean that either one of those things is what made you a terrorist.
Mm-hmm. But how is
You
it a
understand?
symptom? Yeah, but how is ideology a symptom of radicalization?
Because individuals who become radicalized into terrorism tend to absorb ideology of the movement as they become progressively more radicalized, which is different than if, for example, they opened the Quran, read through it, closed it, and said, "That's it. I'm gonna go and kill, in the name of Islam." It doesn't happen like that. It takes something else. In some cases, it takes a charismatic leader. Osama bin Laden was a charismatic leader. There's some charismatic Islamic clerics like Anwar al-Awlaki, who seems to have radicalized a lot of individuals who were already on that path. Sometimes it takes a membership in a group that is already radicalized. So if a group takes you in, like a lot of religious cults, seek out individuals who are kind of lost. They actually go to train stations and look for people who look forlorn, like they haven't showered in a few days. And they take them in and they offer them a warm place to sleep and food and companionship. And people that this happens to very often end up very strong supporters of the cult's ideology, not because they were ideologically headed that way, but the membership in the group was the medium that allowed that ideology to flourish in the individual. And the same way, for example, as the 9/11 attackers were, a very tight knit group of immigrants, Muslim men in Germany, and they became radicalized together. I mean, they weren't radical up until that point. There's no indication that any of the 9/11 attackers had very radical ideas before they got together and started thinking together and talking together, which is actually a very powerful medium of radicalization. There's this process we know in psychology from experimental research that when groups get together and they spend a lot of time in discussion, the tendency is for them to become more polarized. So whatever direction the group was slightly leaning in before, if it was a little conservative, it will become a lot more conservative as a result of discussion. If it's a little bit liberal, it will become a lot more liberal as a result of discussion. It's just a psychological tendency that group discussions have, is to make people more radical in their opinions. Sometimes radicalization is really kind of not related to ideology at all. Sometimes it's an individual who is extremely hungry for power and who enjoys hurting people. So, for example,
So I feel like that's fake radicalization, right? That's like not really radicalization, because the way we defined radicalization is to do it for your beliefs, right? So one of the questions I remember you asked was the one where it was the one about, if would you give water to people that would stand in line to vote, right? Was that from your paper?
I never use that example.
Oh really? Then I maybe
And I
read it
wouldn't
in
use that
another paper.
example because I don't think giving water is breaking any laws or committing violence. So I don't
No.
know how I would.
In that example, it was set up such that it was. So
I never use that.
Okay, what would you use as a test question for determining if somebody is radical, for example? Can you give just a?
Yeah, so I have four questions that assess radicalization. I don't know if I can remember them all, but one is: would you continue to support a group or a cause even if you knew that they resorted to violence? That's one. Would you join a protest or a rally even if you knew that protest was likely to turn violent? Um, would you attack police or security forces if you saw them attacking your group or your cause? And I forget what the fourth one was.
But basically, with all of those examples, the implication is that they believe in the cause, right? So there is never.
I didn't make that implication. I did not make that implication. My definition has nothing to say about beliefs.
By the way, I'm
I'll
sorry.
repeat it for you if you'd like, but I just want to be very clear. The definition is that radicalization is a process by which an individual or a group move progressively toward accepting violence in the name of a group or a cause. So a group can be anything. It could be your nation, it could be your ethnic group, your religious group, it could be, I don't know, your village, right? Your family even. And a cause, again, can be anything. It could be the environment, it can be,
could it be the mafia? Could it be just criminal?
Of course, yes.
Really?
Radicalization is not,
okay.
of course.
Okay.
Of course.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, the founding fathers, by today's standards, and the US government is on record as saying that, today they would be classified as violent radicals.
Wait, but the founding fathers, they have an ideology, and now I would like to know if
they
would
can
you say
have
that
an ideology, but it's not a defining factor. So I mean, an ideology is fine, but it's not what makes or breaks. So people who were fighting for Al Qaeda, shared a lot of ideology with very peaceful Muslims. That's not what made them terrorists.
Yeah,
not beliefs.
It's not a sufficient reason, but it's a necessary reason. That's what I'm saying.
No, I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, you're saying it's not necessary. Okay, I thought it was necessary for because I feel like it's a weird. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like it's weird to think about Al Capone as somebody who's radical or radicalized. I don't know. Maybe it is. I just was under the assumption that
it's just an attitude toward violence as means. Is attitude and your willingness to use violence as means. So, for example, any soldiers, are necessarily radicalized. People, for example, in the US, where it's 100% volunteer military force, when they join the army, they typically have no experience with violence, because if you have a criminal record, they will not let you in. Okay? So to get from that point where they're just young kids with very little experience of anything, and certainly very little experience of violence, if any, to get them to a point where they're ready and willing to kill without a moment's hesitation, the army has to put them through a lot of training where they get desensitized to violence, they change their priorities, they change their idea of themselves, right? Like, it's a whole process. I have a paper about it, and many people have written on it. So any military person who is readying for conflict is going through a process of radicalization. Radicalization is not unique to terrorism. It's not necessarily bad. Sometimes it's every revolution in history, including the American Revolution and the French
Then
Revolution,
would
was
you
committed by radical individuals and groups.
Okay, the reason maybe why I think somebody needs to be radical, needs an ideology in order to be radical. I'm not saying it's a sufficient reason. I'm not saying everyone who has a strong ideology is necessarily radical. I'm just saying that radical ideology is, to me, kind of intuitively. Now I'm overthinking it, but normally intuitively, ideology is necessary in order for radicalism to happen, in my opinion. Because for me, for example, it's a big difference between a soldier that is just doing his duty, or just doing like what he's being told to do, because of, I don't know, anxiety, being scared of disobedience, or even wanting to make money. I feel like is not really the same thing as a person that is like after 9/11 saying, okay, I have to go to Afghanistan, I have to kill some shoot up some Muslims.
I understand it's your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
However, the data we have show that a whole lot of bona fide terrorists and radical individuals do it for reasons that have nothing to do with ideology. For example, people in
Mm-hmm.
Iraq who planted improvised explosive devices. Vast majority, we have those people arrested and interviewed, and what they say is, sometimes they say is the only way to make money for me. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing. I don't care if I blow up some Americans as long as I
Mm-hmm.
can make a buck. And sometimes they say it's fun. Explosions and weapons are fun, and young men, especially, at a particular age and at particular social economic status, are very eager to engage with groups or opportunities that bring them closer to the power and status that guns and explosives bring.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole lot of, really good research, and most of it is not mine, but I encourage you to if you're interested, to look at that suggests that people become terrorists and embrace violence in the name of whatever, for reasons that have very little to do with ideology, at least at first. Once you're shooting and blowing up people for a while as a member of a radical group, chances are good that you're going to be able to spew that ideology. However, even then, so if you I have a colleague at the UN who worked at detention camps where they
Mm-hmm.
in Iraq, where they held actual terrorists, and he tells me, as well as some people who wrote books about it, that these people know very little of Islam. They can't
Mm-hmm.
identify prominent Al Qaeda leaders or ISIS leaders. They're extremely ignorant. So, a well-educated liberal arts person in the US might know more about the
Mm-hmm.
pillars of Islam than
Mm-hmm.
these individuals who kill for something that they believe in is in the name of it. So I understand it's your opinion. I encourage you to look a little deeper into the data.
No, I agree. I agree that there is no positive correlation between amount of ideal. How do you say it? Ideologization. I don't know. And radicalization. So it's not like the more you get into the religion or belief system, the more you get radicalized. That I also read in your paper about that, and that was actually the main point I want to get to. But at the same time, I feel like it's even in really small doses, it's kind of the bedrock on which the whole self-justification works. A lot of it.
Sorry to get nitty-gritty about it, but there is a positive correlation. Just because there is no what I was talking about is that there is no causation. So correlation and causation are different things. As I said, an individual who is part of a radical group is going to absorb that ideology. So you're going to get a positive correlation. It's not, it's not going to be zero. It's not going to be negative for sure.
Really? Okay.
Oh yeah. If you just imagine the population of all the people who are part of radical groups, of them, a certain proportion are going to support the ideology of that group, right? Right. And on the other hand, people who don't support the ideology of that group are not going to be killing for that ideology. So there's going to be a positive correlation. It's not going to be 1-to-1, because a lot of people who support that ideology are not going to be terrorists, and a lot of people who are terrorists are not of that ideology, but there's going to be a positive correlation. I was talking about causation, meaning how do people become radicalized? And I was saying that the data we have does not support a causal relationship between ideology and radical action.
Layman's question time. So the more somebody is into a certain ideology, the higher the probability that he's going to be more radical. Isn't that what correlation means?
The more somebody is radical, the more likely it's going to be that they absorb that ideology. But you have, like, for example, Salafi, people who believe in Salafi Islam, they're extremely, extremely into that ideology. They can recite the Quran from any place, unlike the terrorists in the camps that I was talking about, right? And they're not. They actually believe in, like, kind of a passive and peaceful existence, right? So it's not that's going to give you positive correlation. It's the people who are radical are going to be more likely to, people who are terrorists are going to be more likely to be radical. That's going to get you the positive correlation.
Isn't positive correlation just the x-axis, amount of radicalization, and y-axis, amount of ideology that they're basically subscribing to? And the correlation would be a straight line, basically dots that form a straight line.
The correlation is the slope of the best fit line across all the data points, and each data point is an individual's ideological belief crossed with their support of violence, in my definition, in defense or support of a group or a cause.
So if I have that straight line, basically, if I can draw this cluster, then basically I have a correlation, right?
A correlation is a slope of the line. A line can be flat. That's a zero correlation. And line can also be
positively
inverted like that. That's a negative correlation.
A
positive correlation is the one that goes from the corner of the axis kind of up, right?
X equals Y.
Again, it could be very, very steep slope. That's a very strong positive correlation. It could be very, very, tiny incline, which is also a positive correlation. And I'm saying that what you're likely to find is a slope that's kind of not very much inclined.
Okay, it's not significant. It's not significant. Is that what you're saying?
No. Significant is a complete different thing.
Okay.
Okay. I wasn't realizing that this was going to be like a beginner's, introductory
I need that.
session.
Yeah, it will be.
Statistics and psychology and everything else.
Yeah. So is it?
Significance is determined by a number of other things, including, for example, how many individuals are in your graph. So if we have 5 individuals, then it's very hard to get a statistically significant correlation, even if your line is going straight to the sky.
Okay, let's say we do.
Significance takes into account statistically how many people are in your sample. So the more people in your sample, the easier it is to get a significant result. For example, if my sample is 200 people, I probably need a correlation of 0.25, I want to say, for it to reach significance of 0.05. But if I have a sample of 2,500, I can get a correlation of half that size. And remember, the correlation is the slope of the line. So the line has to go half as steeply for it to count as significant. So don't worry. I mean, we can't have this conversation without actual data. because data have characteristics that we can't just think up on the fly.
But you have the data, right?
I have different kinds of data. I have 20 years of data, but
Okay.
If you're talking about in general, then nobody has those data.
So
because of course, nobody has information about all the terrorists. And
then I'm going to ask you even more stupider of a question. So if I see somebody getting higher and higher in his ideology, amount of ideology is increasing more and more. Should I be worried that is it very likely that that person is going to get radicalized more and more as well?
see, this is very great, very good that we had the conversation we had a second ago, because it very much depends on what ideology you're talking about. Okay, so for example, for the past 5 years, I've been studying QAnon. QAnon is a collection of people numbering in the US somewhere between 15 million and 45 million. We don't know exactly, but it's a huge number of people who believe in conspiracy theories, the central of which is that there is a cabal of Satan worshipping pedophiles who have taken over the US government and the media, who are actively kidnapping children to torture and sexually abuse them and to harvest their blood for adrenochrome, which is a substance they believe is secreted when the child is tortured. And then they consume it, and that gives them vitality and whatever. So these people, believe a bunch of other things, like that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, which is why a lot of them participated in the January 6th insurrection. And so I have a lot of data on people who believe these things. This is an ideology that originally the FBI was really concerned about. They issued a warning and labeled QAnon as a rising threat. They labeled it as a terrorism threat. A number of people, not a large number, but several people have been prosecuted with a terrorism bump in indictments and convictions, who were of the QAnon persuasion. But with the data that I have, which is thousands of people, believers, I am very confident in saying that more commitment to the ideology makes you actually less likely to act on it.
Wait, that's what I said. That's what I said in the beginning. I said,
No, you
didn't you
said,
find
should I be
out?
concerned that if somebody becomes more ideologically committed, that they would
Yeah.
become more radical? And I said to you just now in response to that it depends on the ideology. Because, for example, with QAnon, becoming more ideologically steeped makes you less likely to be engaged in any actual violence.
But only for QAnon, right? And you can't say
Not
that in
only for
general.
QAnon.
For example,
I
but
also,
yeah.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
But you can't say that about in general about ideology and radicalization.
You can't say anything in general
Broadly.
about radicalization, because they're vastly different groups whose ideologies are almost orthogonal to one another. So of course, there's no one thing that can be said about all of them. And the reason I am sticking to my guns about the definition and the measure I use is because it is generally enough on the level of human psychology that I don't get into the nitty gritty of what it is that you believe in. I don't care what you believe in. I just care about whether or not you support violence in defense of whatever. Yeah. So it's true of QAnon that more ideology means less actual radicalization. In my research on incels, it's also the result I find among incels. So individuals who are more committed to the black pill ideology and more committed to the whole belief system of inceldom are actually scoring significantly lower on the radicalization scale than people who believe it less. Okay.